The man who saved the CEO's life woke up wearing handcuffs. Those words spread through the hospital hallway before anyone understood the truth behind them. Marcus Bennett opened his eyes beneath the soft white lights of a private room at Arlington Memorial Hospital, his mind slowly returning to the sound of confusion, the flashing cameras, and the moment everything changed. He was supposed to be remembered as the person who protected a life. Instead, the first thing he saw was a uniformed officer standing beside his bed. "Marcus Bennett," the officer said calmly, "you need to understand that you are being questioned as part of the investigation." Marcus stared silently, trying to process the words. His body was still recovering, but the confusion in his eyes was stronger than the exhaustion. "Questioned?" he whispered. "After what happened?" The officer did not answer immediately. Then Marcus heard the unmistakable sound of metal locking around his wrist. Across town, millions of people were watching the news coverage about Alexander Whitmore, the billionaire CEO of Whitmore Global, who had survived a frightening incident during a charity event in Washington, D.C. Reporters called it a shocking moment. They praised the quick actions of an unknown security guard who had stepped forward when everyone else froze. But within hours, the story changed. Questions appeared. Rumors spread. And somehow, the same man who had been called a hero was now being treated like a suspect. Marcus looked through the hospital window at the city lights of Arlington, Virginia, glowing beneath the evening sky. He had spent his entire life learning one lesson. People often see what they expect to see. They saw his security uniform. They saw his quiet voice. They saw a black man working a job that many considered ordinary. They rarely saw the discipline, the sacrifice, or the years of experience hidden behind his calm expression. "I need to speak with Mr. Whitmore," Marcus said. His voice was steady, even though his heart carried a deep disappointment. The officer looked away for a moment. "He has not made a statement yet." Marcus lowered his eyes. That answer hurt more than he expected. Just hours earlier, Alexander Whitmore had looked at him with gratitude. He had called Marcus a lifesaver. Now, silence filled the space between them. Meanwhile, inside the Whitmore family home outside Bethesda, Maryland, Alexander's wife, Victoria Whitmore, stood frozen in disbelief while watching the news. The elegant living room that usually felt warm and welcoming suddenly felt cold. She watched the screen replay the moment Marcus moved without hesitation to protect her husband. Her expression changed when she heard the investigation reports. "No," she whispered. "That cannot be right." Alexander looked at her quietly. "Victoria, we don't know everything yet." She turned toward him. "But we know one thing. He saved you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The memory of Marcus's calm presence returned to Alexander's mind. He remembered how the security guard always arrived early, always checked every detail, always noticed things other people ignored. Marcus had never asked for praise. He had never tried to impress anyone. He simply did his job with quiet dignity. But now, the world was questioning the very person who had stood between danger and a powerful man. In his hospital room, Marcus closed his eyes and remembered something his mother used to tell him when he was young. "Your character is who you are when nobody is watching." He never imagined those words would be tested this way. He had protected someone because it was the right thing to do. He had not expected recognition. He had not expected a reward. But he also never expected to wake up and feel like the world had forgotten what truly happened. Outside, the city continued moving. Cars passed through the streets. People walked beneath the lights. And somewhere beyond those hospital walls, the truth was waiting to be discovered. Because Marcus Bennett was not who they thought he was. And soon, everyone would learn that the quiet security guard they underestimated had a story far greater than anyone imagined. 3 days before Marcus Bennett woke up in a hospital room surrounded by questions, he was the man everyone overlooked. At Whitmore Global's headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, Marcus walked through the marble lobby every morning before sunrise, wearing a simple dark security uniform and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed attention. Most employees knew his face, but few knew his story. To them, he was the guard who opened doors, checked visitor badges, and stood near elevators with a polite nod. They saw the uniform before they saw the person. Marcus had learned long ago that people often made decisions about him before they ever heard him speak. He did not argue. He did not chase approval. He simply showed up, did his work, and treated everyone with respect. "Morning, Marcus," the receptionist, Emily Carter, would say every day. "You are always here before the coffee machine starts." Marcus would smile and reply, "Someone has to make sure the building is ready for everyone else." It was a small answer, but it showed the kind of person he was. He believed responsibility was not about recognition. It was about being dependable when others needed you. Marcus lived in a modest apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, just a short drive from his workplace. His home was simple, with a small bookshelf, a worn leather chair, and a framed photograph of his parents sitting near the window. His mother had always reminded him that a person's value was never measured by their job title. "A uniform does not define the person wearing it," she used to tell him. "Your choices do." Those words stayed with Marcus through every difficult moment of his life. At 38 years old, he had already experienced enough to understand that people could be both kind and unfair. He had seen strangers judge him quickly because of his appearance. He had watched opportunities disappear because someone decided they already knew who he was. But Marcus refused to let bitterness become part of him. Every morning, he chose patience. Every day, he chose dignity. At Whitmore Global, his calm nature eventually caught the attention of Alexander Whitmore, the company's founder and chief executive officer. Alexander was a man surrounded by powerful people. Executives, advisors, and security specialists filled his schedule. Yet Marcus was different. He did not try to impress him. He did not act nervous around wealth or influence. He simply treated Alexander like another person. One afternoon, Alexander noticed Marcus carefully reviewing the lobby area after a large business meeting. "You always pay attention to details," Alexander said. Marcus turned and gave a small smile. "Details are usually where problems begin, sir." Alexander remembered those words. Unlike many people around him, Marcus never seemed interested in gaining something from their conversations. He was respectful without being afraid. That quality stood out. Over time, Marcus became part of Alexander's daily security routine, not because he demanded the position, but because he earned trust through consistency. However, outside the walls of Whitmore Global, few people knew anything about him. They did not know about the years of discipline that shaped him. They did not know about the difficult choices that brought him to a quieter life. They only saw a black security guard standing beside a powerful white CEO. And that was exactly why so many people underestimated him. Even Victoria Whitmore, Alexander's wife, struggled at first to understand why her husband trusted Marcus so much. During a private conversation at their home in Bethesda, Maryland, she asked, "Alexander, there are hundreds of security professionals in this country. Why him?" Alexander looked out toward the garden and answered calmly, "Because Marcus notices things other people miss." Victoria did not respond. She respected her husband, but she still saw Marcus through the limited picture everyone else saw: a guard, an employee, someone standing outside the circle of power. She did not know that the quiet man walking through the halls every day carried experiences that would soon change everything. She did not know that the person she barely understood would become the reason her family still had hope. And Marcus himself had no idea that his ordinary morning routine was leading him toward a moment that would reveal who he truly was. Alexander Whitmore had built an empire by making decisions faster than most people could understand. From the glass offices of Whitmore Global's headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, he managed a company that influenced industries across the country. Investors trusted him. Employees respected him. The media followed his every announcement. But behind the polished image was a man who had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Every handshake came with an expectation. Every conversation carried a hidden purpose. That was why Marcus Bennett stood out. Marcus never asked for favors. He never tried to use his position near the CEO to gain attention. He simply did his job with quiet focus. Alexander noticed that difference. One afternoon, after a long executive meeting, Alexander walked through the lobby and saw Marcus helping an elderly visitor find the correct office. The woman looked confused and embarrassed, holding a folder against her chest. "I am sorry," she said. "I think I am in the wrong place." Marcus smiled gently. "No need to apologize. Everyone gets turned around in a building this large. Let me help you." He walked her to the right elevator, explained where she needed to go, and waited until she felt comfortable. Alexander watched from a distance. Many employees would have ignored the situation, assuming someone else would handle it. Marcus did not. He saw a person who needed help. Later that day, Alexander stopped beside him near the security desk. "You know, most people would have just pointed her toward the elevator," Alexander said. Marcus looked up. "Sometimes people need more than directions, sir. Sometimes they need someone to take a moment." Alexander remembered that sentence. It was simple, but it revealed something about Marcus that money could not buy. Marcus valued people. Meanwhile, inside the Whitmore family home in Bethesda, Maryland, Victoria Whitmore continued, trying to understand why her husband placed so much trust in a security guard. Victoria was intelligent, successful, and accustomed to a world where every person had a specific role. She had spent decades moving through elite circles where appearances often determined first impressions. During a quiet evening at home, she sat across from Alexander in their living room. "You really trust him," she said. Alexander looked away from his laptop. "Yes. More than the private security company we hired?" she asked. "Sometimes trust is not about credentials," Alexander replied. "It is about character." Victoria paused. She understood the words, but she still struggled to see Marcus beyond his position. To her, he was still the man standing near the entrance, watching from the background. She did not know the years of discipline behind his calm expression. She did not know how carefully he had rebuilt his life after leaving a world where every decision carried enormous responsibility. Marcus never spoke about his past. When coworkers asked about his life before security work, he simply answered, "I spent some time learning what matters." That answer always made people curious, but Marcus never explained further. He preferred actions over stories. He believed a person's history should not be used to demand respect. Respect should come from what they do today. At Whitmore Global, Marcus slowly became someone Alexander depended on, not because of his title, but because of his awareness. He noticed when employees were stressed. He remembered names. He treated cleaning staff, executives, and visitors with the same level of courtesy. One evening, Alexander found Marcus checking the building after most employees had left. The halls were quiet, and the city lights reflected against the windows. "You ever think about doing something bigger?" Alexander asked. Marcus looked surprised. "Bigger than this?" "You know what I mean," Alexander said. "You have qualities that go beyond security." Marcus gave a small smile. "Everyone has a purpose, Mr. Whitmore. Mine is just different from yours." Alexander studied him for a moment. There was humility in those words, but also confidence. Marcus was not someone searching for recognition. He was someone who had already found peace with who he was. Yet neither man knew that the connection they had built would soon be tested in a way neither expected. A night meant to celebrate generosity and success would reveal the difference between appearance and truth. And when that moment arrived, the world would finally understand why Alexander Whitmore had trusted the quiet man everyone else overlooked. The evening of the Whitmore Foundation Gala began like any other important night in Washington, D.C. The city was glowing beneath a clear autumn sky, and inside the grand halls of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, hundreds of guests gathered to celebrate a charity event focused on supporting young innovators across America. Business leaders, community representatives, and public figures filled the room with conversations and laughter. At the center of it all was Alexander Whitmore, the man everyone came to see. But standing several steps behind him was Marcus Bennett, quietly observing everything around him. Marcus was not interested in the attention surrounding the event. He was focused on his responsibility. He watched the entrances, noticed the movement of guests, and paid attention to small details most people ignored. "You know, Marcus," Alexander said while greeting supporters, "I think you are the only person here who is not impressed by this room." Marcus smiled slightly. "A room can be beautiful, sir, but people are always more important than the walls around them." Alexander laughed softly. "That is exactly why I trust you." Nearby, Victoria Whitmore listened to the conversation. For the first time in a long while, she looked at Marcus differently. She still did not fully understand him, but she noticed something she had overlooked before. Marcus carried himself with a calmness that did not come from status. It came from experience. As the evening continued, Marcus moved through the event with quiet awareness. He greeted employees by name, helped guests who needed assistance, and remained respectful toward everyone around him. A young volunteer accidentally dropped a stack of programs near the entrance, looking embarrassed as people walked past. Marcus immediately helped collect them. "Thank you," the volunteer said. "I thought everyone would just ignore me." Marcus handed back the papers and replied, "Everyone deserves help when they need it." It was a simple moment, but it reflected who Marcus had always been. Later that night, Alexander stepped onto the stage to give a speech about leadership and responsibility. Marcus stood near the side of the room, watching the crowd. The lights reflected across the polished floor, and the sound of conversations slowly faded as Alexander began speaking. "Success is not measured only by what we build," Alexander said. "It is measured by the people we choose to lift along the way." Marcus listened carefully. He had heard many speeches from powerful people before, but those words felt different because he knew Alexander was beginning to understand that leadership was about more than business. Then Marcus noticed something unusual. Not something dramatic, just a small detail that did not belong. A person who appeared uncomfortable. A movement that seemed out of place. A moment where the rhythm of the room changed. Marcus's expression became focused. Years of discipline taught him that the smallest details could matter. He quietly approached Alexander. "Sir," Marcus said in a calm voice, "I need you to stay close to me for a moment." Alexander looked at him and immediately recognized the seriousness in his tone. "What did you notice?" he asked. Marcus did not answer right away. He simply guided Alexander away from the center of the room while keeping his attention on the surroundings. Victoria noticed the change and stepped closer. "Alexander, what is happening?" Before anyone could understand, the atmosphere inside the room shifted. The music stopped. Conversations disappeared. People turned toward the sudden movement around them. Marcus did not think about his own safety. He did not think about recognition. He only thought about one thing: protecting the person who had trusted him. In a single moment, the quiet security guard everyone overlooked proved exactly who he was. The night that was supposed to celebrate success became the night that revealed the true meaning of courage. And while the world would later focus on what happened after that moment, the people who were there would always remember one thing. Marcus Bennett did not see a billionaire CEO standing in front of him. He saw a human being who needed someone to stand beside him. The moment everything changed inside the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts lasted only a few seconds, but for Marcus Bennett, those seconds would follow him for the rest of his life. The room that had been filled with music and conversation became silent as everyone tried to understand what had happened. Alexander Whitmore looked around in disbelief. The man who had spent the entire evening standing quietly in the background had become the person everyone was looking at. Marcus remained calm, even as the confusion around him grew. His only concern was making sure Alexander and the people nearby were safe. "Marcus," Alexander said, his voice filled with concern, "are you okay?" Marcus looked at him and gave a small nod. "I am fine, sir. Stay focused. We need to make sure everyone is all right." That was Marcus. Even in a moment when people were worried about him, he was still thinking about others. Emergency personnel arrived, and Marcus was taken to Arlington Memorial Hospital for medical attention. Alexander wanted to go with him immediately, but investigators asked him to remain available to answer questions about what happened. Victoria Whitmore stood beside her husband, still trying to process everything she had witnessed. Hours earlier, she had seen Marcus as simply an employee. Now she saw him as the person who had placed responsibility above everything else. "Alexander," she whispered, "he saved you." Alexander did not answer right away. He looked toward the hospital entrance as Marcus disappeared from view. "Yes," he finally said. "He did." But while the public praised Marcus Bennett for his actions, the situation quickly became complicated. Investigators began reviewing every detail of the event. They examined security footage, interviewed witnesses, and looked carefully into everyone connected to the incident. Because of Marcus's position near Alexander, his name naturally became part of the investigation. The following morning, the atmosphere changed. News outlets reported that authorities were asking questions about the security arrangements. Rumors began spreading faster than facts. People who had never spoken to Marcus suddenly had opinions about him. Some questioned how a man in a security role could have been so close to such an important figure. Others suggested explanations without knowing the truth. Inside the hospital room, Marcus slowly opened his eyes. The pain of recovery was not the hardest thing for him to handle. The hardest part was seeing suspicion replace gratitude. A detective entered the room with a serious expression. "Mr. Bennett, we need to ask you a few questions." Marcus looked at him calmly. "About what happened?" The detective paused. "About your involvement." Marcus stared quietly. "My involvement was protecting Mr. Whitmore." The detective placed a folder on the table. "There are questions about your background, your timing, and your connection to the event." Marcus felt something heavy settle inside him. Not anger, not fear, disappointment. "My connection to Mr. Whitmore is that I was assigned to protect him," he said. "And I did exactly that." Later that day, Victoria arrived at the hospital with Alexander. They stood outside Marcus's room, unsure how to approach him. Alexander looked through the window and saw Marcus resting quietly. "He deserves better than this," Alexander said. Victoria remained silent. She remembered all the moments when she had underestimated him. The times she had seen his uniform instead of his character. The times she had assumed his role explained his entire life. "I was wrong about him," she finally admitted. Alexander looked at her. "We both were." But before they could enter the room, an investigator approached with a serious expression. "Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore, we need to speak with you." Alexander turned. "About what?" The investigator looked toward Marcus's room. "About Marcus Bennett." A pause filled the hallway. "There are things about his past that you do not know." And in that moment, the questions surrounding Marcus were about to reveal a truth that would change everything they thought they understood about the quiet man who had saved a life. The hallway outside Marcus Bennett's hospital room felt unusually quiet. The bright lights above reflected against the polished floor, and the steady sound of footsteps passing by seemed distant, almost unreal. Inside the room, Marcus sat alone, looking through the window at the city of Arlington, Virginia. The world outside continued moving, but his own life felt suspended in one uncertain moment. He had spent years protecting others without expecting anything in return. Yet now, the person who had chosen to do the right thing was the one being questioned. Marcus rested his hands on the blanket and stared at the small details around him. The hospital monitor, the chair beside the bed, the simple glass of water on the table, ordinary things that somehow felt heavier than before. A nurse named Rachel entered the room quietly. She had been caring for Marcus since he arrived, and she had noticed something different about him. He never complained. He never blamed anyone. "You know," Rachel said softly, "most people would be angry after everything that happened." Marcus looked toward her. "Anger is easy," he replied. "Understanding takes more work." Rachel paused. She had heard many people talk about forgiveness, but Marcus spoke as if he had practiced it his entire life. "Do you really think they will believe you?" she asked. Marcus looked back toward the window. "The truth does not need me to force it. It just needs time to be found." Meanwhile, in a conference room inside Whitmore Global's headquarters, Alexander and Victoria sat across from federal investigators. The room that usually hosted business negotiations now carried a different kind of tension. On the table were documents, reports, and information about Marcus Bennett's background. Alexander looked at the investigator. "You said there are things we do not know about Marcus." The investigator opened a folder. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore. The person you know as a security guard has a much more complicated history." Victoria leaned forward. "What does that mean?" The investigator looked through the documents before answering. Marcus Bennett was never just a security employee. Silence filled the room. Alexander exchanged a glance with Victoria. Then who was he? The investigator continued carefully. Before working at Whitmore Global, Marcus was involved in specialized security operations. He spent years protecting people in situations where preparation, judgment, and discipline were critical. Alexander listened closely. Memories began returning. The way Marcus always noticed changes in his surroundings. The way he stayed calm when others became overwhelmed. The way he understood risks before anyone else recognized them. Suddenly, small moments from the past carried new meaning. Victoria lowered her eyes. "He never told us." The investigator nodded. "That is because Marcus was not looking for recognition. After leaving that chapter of his life, he chose a quieter path. Back at the hospital, Marcus received a visitor. It was Alexander. For a moment, neither man spoke. Alexander looked at the handcuffs still attached to the situation surrounding Marcus, and shame crossed his face. "Marcus," he said quietly, "I do not know what to say." Marcus looked at him calmly. "You do not have to say anything." Alexander stepped closer. "I should have been there for you." Marcus remained silent. The CEO, who was used to controlling every situation, suddenly looked like a man who did not know how to repair a mistake. "I trusted you with my life," Alexander said, "but I did not trust you enough with the truth about who you were." Marcus looked at him. Sometimes people only see what they expect to see. The words stayed in the room. Alexander understood that Marcus was not only talking about himself, he was talking about every person who had been judged before being understood. Later that evening, the investigation team continued reviewing Marcus's history. More information appeared. More questions were answered. The image of a simple security guard began disappearing, replaced by the story of a man who had spent years quietly serving others. And for the first time since the night at the gala, the people around Marcus began seeing the person behind the uniform. Not a position, not a label. A man with courage, discipline, and a lifetime of choices that proved his character. The truth about Marcus Bennett did not arrive with noise or headlines. It arrived quietly, through documents, conversations, and the slow realization that everyone had misunderstood the man standing beside them for years. Inside the Federal Investigation Office in Washington, D.C., agents continued reviewing Marcus's background. The information they uncovered changed the entire direction of the case. On the screen in front of them was a timeline that stretched back more than a decade. Marcus Bennett was not simply a security professional who happened to be in the right place at the right time. He was someone who had spent years preparing for moments when others needed someone to remain calm. Agent Daniel Harper looked across the table at Alexander Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, there is something you need to understand. Marcus did not become capable overnight. This is who he has always been." Alexander looked at the documents carefully. Why would someone with that kind of experience choose to work as a security guard? The agent paused before answering. "Because not everyone who serves others wants recognition." Those words stayed with Alexander. He thought about every interaction he had shared with Marcus. The quiet greetings, the careful observations, the moments when Marcus helped people without anyone noticing. Suddenly, those memories looked different. They were not random acts of kindness. They were reflections of a man who had built his life around responsibility. Victoria sat beside Alexander, reading through the information with a mixture of surprise and regret. "He could have told us," she said softly. Agent Harper shook his head. "Maybe he could have. But Marcus Bennett is not someone who measures his worth by what people know about him." Back at Arlington Memorial Hospital, Marcus continued recovering. He had heard that investigators were looking into his past, but he did not ask for updates. He remained patient, believing that facts would eventually speak louder than assumptions. A hospital worker named James approached him during the afternoon. James had seen the news reports and wanted to understand the man behind the story. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" he said. "Why did you never tell anyone about your background?" Marcus looked at him and smiled slightly. "Because I was not trying to become someone important." James looked confused. "But you already were." Marcus looked toward the window. "Being important is not about what people say about you. It is about what you do when nobody is watching." Those words reached Alexander later that day when he visited again. This time, he did not walk in like a CEO entering a room. He walked in like a man who finally understood the person in front of him. "Marcus," Alexander said, "I owe you an apology." Marcus looked up. "For what?" Alexander took a moment before answering. "For seeing your position before seeing your character." The room became quiet. Marcus did not immediately respond. He understood that apologies were not about making the person who apologized feel better. They were about acknowledging the truth. "Many people make that mistake," Marcus finally said. "The important thing is what they choose to do after they realize it." Alexander nodded slowly. Outside the hospital, reporters continued searching for answers. The public wanted to know who Marcus Bennett really was. But the people closest to the situation were learning something more important. Marcus was not defined by the work he did, the clothes he wore, or the assumptions others placed on him. He was defined by every choice he made when there was no reward waiting. Meanwhile, the federal investigation reached a critical point. New evidence confirmed that Marcus had not been connected to the incident in the way people originally believed. Instead, investigators discovered that someone else had carefully created confusion around the event. The person responsible had counted on people making quick judgments. They had expected everyone to focus on appearances instead of facts. But they underestimated one thing. Truth has a way of finding the people who are willing to look deeper. And now, the world was about to discover not only who Marcus Bennett truly was, but also who had tried to hide the truth from everyone. The truth that had been hidden for so long was finally beginning to reach the people who needed to hear it. Inside the Federal Investigation Office in Washington, D.C., the final pieces of the case were coming together. The evidence showed what Marcus Bennett had known from the beginning. He was never the person people should have questioned. He was the person who had stood between danger and a life that mattered. Agent Daniel Harper walked into the conference room carrying the final report. Alexander Whitmore and Victoria Whitmore were waiting. The atmosphere was quiet, but everyone understood that the moment had arrived. "We have completed the review," Agent Harper said. Marcus Bennett was not involved in what happened that night. In fact, his actions prevented a much worse outcome. Alexander lowered his eyes. Even though he had already begun to understand the truth, hearing the official confirmation carried a different weight. Victoria placed her hand over her mouth, overwhelmed by the realization of how quickly she had believed the worst about someone who had protected her family. "I accused him," she whispered. "After everything he did, I believed the rumors before I believed him." Agent Harper looked at her calmly. "Mrs. Whitmore, many people made assumptions because they only saw what was visible. They saw his position. They did not see his character." Those words followed Victoria as she walked through the hospital hallway later that afternoon. She remembered every time Marcus had greeted her politely, every time he had helped someone without expecting anything, every time she had looked past him because she believed she already understood who he was. When she entered Marcus's room, she stopped for a moment. He was sitting near the window, quietly reading a book. The same calm expression he always carried was still there. "Marcus," Victoria said softly. He looked up. "Mrs. Whitmore." She stepped closer, but for once, she did not know what to say. "I owe you an apology." Marcus closed the book and listened. Victoria took a deep breath. "I judged you before I knew you. I looked at your job and your appearance, and I convinced myself that I understood you." Her voice became quieter. "I was wrong." Marcus remained silent for a moment. He was not angry. He was not looking for revenge. He simply allowed her to be honest. "The hardest thing about being underestimated," Marcus said, "is not proving people wrong. It is remembering that their opinion does not define your worth." Victoria looked down. Those words affected her more than any accusation could have. Later that evening, Alexander entered the room alone. The CEO, who had negotiated billion-dollar agreements and led thousands of employees, stood quietly beside Marcus's bed. For the first time, he was not there as a powerful executive. He was there as a man who wanted to make things right. "Marcus," Alexander said, "I spent years believing I understood people. I thought I could recognize talent, loyalty, and character. But I failed to see what was right in front of me." Marcus looked at him. "What matters is what you see now," Alexander nodded. Then, without concern for his reputation or his image, he lowered himself in front of Marcus. The gesture was not about status. It was about humility. "You protected my life," Alexander said. "And when you needed trust, I was not there for you." Marcus looked at the man who had once been the center of the room wherever he went. Now, that same man was admitting his mistake. "I do not need you to repay me," Marcus said. "I only hope that the next time someone is overlooked, someone chooses to see them." Alexander stood quietly. He understood that Marcus was offering something far greater than forgiveness. He was offering a lesson about judgment, humanity, and the importance of looking beyond what people see first. Outside the hospital, the investigation continued toward its final stage. The person responsible for creating the confusion around the incident was identified, and the truth was finally becoming clear. But for Marcus Bennett, the greatest victory was not seeing others apologize. It was knowing that his actions had remained true, even when people doubted him. He had never protected others because he wanted applause. He had done it because that was the kind of person he chose to be. And now, the people who once saw only a security guard finally saw the man behind the uniform. Several months after the night that changed everything, Marcus Bennett returned to the place where his story had been misunderstood. The halls of Whitmore Global in Arlington, Virginia, looked exactly the same. The marble floors still reflected the morning light. The elevator still opened and closed with the same quiet sound. Employees still hurried through the lobby carrying coffee, documents, and busy schedules. But something was different. The way people looked at Marcus had changed. Not because he wore a different uniform. Not because his position had changed. It changed because people finally understood the person behind it. As Marcus walked through the lobby, employees stopped to greet him. "Good morning, Marcus," Emily Carter said with a warm smile. "It is good to see you back." Marcus nodded. "Good morning, Emily. It is good to be here." Near the entrance, a young employee watched him with admiration. "Is he really the person everyone has been talking about?" he asked quietly. Emily smiled. He was that person long before anyone knew his story. Alexander Whitmore had also changed. The experience had left a permanent mark on him. He still ran his company. He still made important decisions. But he no longer viewed leadership the same way. He began spending more time listening to employees who were usually ignored. He created programs that gave opportunities to people based on ability and dedication rather than assumptions. One of the first initiatives he introduced was the Marcus Bennett Leadership Program, designed to support individuals who demonstrated responsibility, courage, and integrity in their communities. When Alexander announced the program, he stood in front of employees and spoke honestly. "For years, I believed leadership came from having the highest position in the room. Marcus taught me that true leadership comes from the person willing to stand up when nobody is watching." The room became silent. Marcus stood among the employees, uncomfortable with the attention but grateful for the message. Later, Alexander approached him. "You still do not like being recognized, do you?" Marcus smiled. "Recognition is nice, but it was never the reason I helped." Alexander nodded. "That is exactly why people remember you." Victoria Whitmore also carried the lesson with her. She became more aware of the way first impressions could create unfair judgments. She started volunteering with organizations focused on creating opportunities for people who were often overlooked. One afternoon, she visited a community center in Alexandria, Virginia, where young students were meeting professionals from different backgrounds. She watched Marcus speak with a group of teenagers about responsibility and choices. One student raised his hand and asked, "How do you stay confident when people do not believe in you?" Marcus thought for a moment before answering. "You remember that other people's opinions are temporary. Your character is something you build every day." The students listened carefully. They were not hearing a speech from a famous person. They were hearing advice from someone who had lived through difficult moments and still chose kindness. Years later, people would remember the headlines and the investigation. They would remember the confusion and the questions. But the people who truly knew Marcus remembered something else. They remembered the way he treated everyone with respect. They remembered that he helped without asking who was watching. They remembered that when he had every reason to become bitter, he chose to remain human. On a quiet evening in Arlington, Marcus stood outside the Whitmore Global building after finishing his work. The city lights reflected across the windows above him. The streets were filled with people moving through their own stories, each carrying struggles that others could not see. Marcus looked up at the building and thought about how much had changed. He had once been invisible to many people. Now they saw him. But deep down, Marcus knew the most important thing was not being noticed. It was making sure others were not ignored. He adjusted his jacket, took one final look at the city, and walked forward. No applause followed him. No cameras waited. Just the quiet sound of footsteps and the certainty that doing the right thing had never required anyone else's permission.